Hello, everybody. This is Books of the Stock Market. How's everyone doing? As for me, I'm doing pretty well. It's been raining all week and the running conditions weren't so great. But in today's video, we'll be looking at Intel. Pat Gelsinger did an extensive interview with the BBC 2 weeks ago and it was pretty interesting. Before Intel completely lost most of its market share to AMD, Intel basically had a monopoly in the CPU area. Everyone was buying Intel CPUs since they were much better than AMD, who was their closest competitor. However, this all changed in 2017 when AMD released their Ryzen processors, which are much cheaper and faster. This caused Intel to lose market share, and this reflected heavily on Intel's stock price. Excluding a drop that happened due to the coronavirus, we saw Intel fall from around the $65 range all the way down to the $43 range. That is a 33% drop. Fortunately, we saw Intel stock recover from the horrendous drop, and we are at the high $60 range. There are many factors that played into Intel recovering back to its original price. Obviously, the market in general are really pushing new highs due to the Fed printing money and keeping this economy afloat. But other than that, I believe the most important reason for Intel returning to its original price range is due to Intel replacing their CEO with Pat Gelsinger. We will go into more details about the importance of this move, but all I know is that Intel stock didn't recover due to them making better CPUs. AMD still makes better CPUs, but due to Pat Gelsinger's direction, I believe that more people are hopeful about Intel. Before we get into what exactly was said during the interview with Pat Gelsinger, let's do a little portfolio update. Let's look at Ethereum first. We see that we're now around at 296.71% in unrealized gains. Once again, this is pretty good, and we see that Ethereum is trying to break out of the $2,500 range. Currently, it got rejected by the $2,500 range and is consolidating underneath that level. As for Litecoin, this coin really impressed me last week. In a previous video where we discussed Palantir, I said that we had to watch the $230 level and the $367 level, as those two levels represent the body and the wick of the all-time highs candle back in 2017. Currently, we see Litecoin trading at the $323 range, which means Litecoin has finally broken out of the body of the all-time high candle from 2017. I believe that we will just need to wait for a few more days to see Litecoin hit the $367 range. Finally, here's my Roth IRA. I recently positioned myself into GBTC. I currently have 118 GBTC and I'm already up $103. GBTC is a pretty interesting investment tool as I think it is heavily affected by the hype. It does track the price of Bitcoin moderately well, but on days where we see Bitcoin pumping and a lot of people are talking about it, GBTC seems to follow it in a non-linear fashion. Anyways, I had some cash lying around, so I bought one ETHE, which is Grayscale's Ethereum tracker. Now, let's get into what Pat Gelsinger said. On March 24th, the BBC released an article about their talk with Pat Gelsinger. But before we talk about what he specifically said during the interview, let's talk about Pat Gelsinger. Pat Gelsinger became the CEO of Intel in early January. He replaced Bob Swan, and Pat was the CEO of VMware before replacing him. At this time, we saw Intel stock rise 7.5% while VMware stock dropped 6.5%. As you can see, his departure and arrival really affected both companies. So who's Pat Gelsinger and why can he cause such huge price swings? Let's start off with his education history. Pat Gelsinger was born in 1961 in Pennsylvania. He moved to California and went to Santa Clara University and studied electrical engineering. Once he got his bachelor's, he went to Stanford University where he got his master's in electrical engineering and computer science. He eventually became Intel's first ever chief technology officer. He stayed at Intel for 30 years, but he then moved on to different companies. Most notable is VMware, where he was CEO for around 8 years. During his stay at VMware, we saw VMware go up by 74.34%. Honestly, this is not good since most tech stocks will be up at least 100% in 8 years, but at least it wasn't negative. Anyways, the important part of all this is who Pat Gelsinger replaced. Pat Gelsinger replaced Bob Swan. Bob Swan does not have a tech background, but instead he's a full business major. He got his MBA from Binghamton University and was the CFO at GE before moving over to Intel. For tech companies, I really dislike it when the CEO is not an engineer. I mean, look at the top tech companies such as Google and Facebook. Even Tim Cook has a bachelor's in engineering. An engineer on top would know how to develop tech properly in a manageable amount of time. I bet Bob Swan was a good leader in terms of business, like min-maxing costs and juicing out the maximum amount of profit. However, during his time as CEO, we barely saw Intel develop further in terms of tech. This caused AMD to catch up, and we eventually saw AMD overtake them in terms of processing power. AMD took over the consumer and business space in terms of CPU market share. The head of AMD during the time was Dr. Lisa Su, and she's an engineer. Although all of AMD's success can't be attributed to her, I bet she played a role in developing AMD's tech to catch up and eventually beat Intel. Therefore, this move where we saw Intel replace Bob Swan for an actual engineer is a pretty positive move. Now let's get into what Pat Gelsinger said in his interview with the BBC. From the interview, it looks like Pat Gelsinger wants more chips to be made out of Asia and more specifically in the hands of Intel. He states that most of today's processors are made by TSMC and Samsung. He is pushing Intel to set up a new division to make more chips for other companies. More importantly, however, he wants to make Intel's chip in-house so they can more effectively integrate design and production. To achieve this goal, he stated that Intel will need to invest $20 billion into 2 new fabrication plants in Arizona as well as expanding its Irish facility. But he also said that he's not expecting to expand the Intel plant that is located in China. In the end, he's pushing this move for Intel to produce more computer chips because he does not like having 80% of the supply in Asia, and he believes that every aspect of humanity is becoming more digital, and when it becomes more digital, it runs on semiconductors. These statements pretty much align with the stance that he's not going to expand the manufacturing plant in China. However, this announcement did not amuse all investors. An activist investor wanted Pat Gelsinger to go with a fabless business model. A fabless business model is where a company designs a CPU and then outsources the actual manufacturing to another company, such as Samsung and TSMC. Ignoring these complaints, Pat Gelsinger is going all in with manufacturing because, as mentioned before, he sees the exponential rise in demand. He said that COVID was just the beginning and that semiconductors will always be in high demand. He believes that Intel is one of the few companies that can transition into manufacturing in a much easier way. Furthermore, there are only a few companies that are in this space, so Intel should be able to carve out a nice piece of the pie. Obviously, this brings up the question if Samsung and TSMC will continue to do business with Intel, as they're basically saying they're going to take business away from these two companies. Naturally, Pat Gelsinger gave the generic PR response that this is going to be a co-op petition, which means that they are going to continue to have strong partnerships but also compete a little bit. He then wrapped up the interview saying that they should be on pace to produce chips that will perform pretty well. He said that Intel had problems with their 10nm processor, which affected their 7nm development. But now they know which techniques to focus on, and he believes that Intel will be able to once again produce high-quality chips. And that pretty much ends the interview. The main takeaway from this interview is that Intel will be focusing on manufacturing computer chips. Intel should be able to enter this market without many problems, as in the past they did make chips and they just need to expand their facilities. As for what the stock is doing now, we see that it is hovering at its high at around $68. However, it was not able to break out of this region and we're back at the $65 range. I do not see any patterns or anything, so it's pretty hard to see where Intel is going to go from here. With that, I'm going to end this video. If you liked this video and want to watch more videos like this, press the subscribe button. If you thought this video helped you in any way, like the video as it really supports the channel. If you have any questions, leave a comment below and I'll try my best to answer the questions. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see everyone on Sunday. Thanks.